Welcome to Old Path and our study through the Old Testament. We are currently in the book of Psalms. We'll be at Psalm 19. Looks like we'll get through Psalms 19, 20, and 21 today. And before I actually look at any of the text, I want to kind of make a little bit of an announcement that kind of came together pretty quick. We had planned on not going back to Israel until 2025, assuming we'd be able to as far as travel is concerned worldwide. But it looks like we're going to add on a trip for next year, which will be in the springtime. It'll be at the beginning of April. So if it's something that you're interested in, you've never been to Israel, or you'd like to go back, we'd love to get you the information about the trip and answer any questions that you may have. As of this date, and we are in the beginning, or actually getting to the middle of June, hard to believe, but we're in the middle of June in 2023, and as it sits right now, there are no travel restrictions for any COVID. There's no mandatory vaccination. There's no testing that's going on. There's nothing that would prevent us from being able to go as normal travel like before the days of COVID. So long as that holds and nothing changes, then we're planning to go, like I say, in the springtime of 2024. And we have lots of details on it for you. So if you're interested, please let me know. You can do so through the website, which is oldpaththeology.net. And you can send any correspondence to us there through the email tab that's there. It just says contact us, I believe. And that'll send an email directly to me. But I can get you the details about the trip, and we'd love to have you along while that window or that door stays open to us. To be able to travel freely between here and Israel. We like to try to get back there about every year, and our last one that we had earlier this year, just a few months ago, was phenomenal. It was just a terrific trip, and we'd love to take somebody or anybody who would like to go and see it for themselves. There's nothing quite like it. It is very much a life-changing trip. So I wanted to make that announcement up there, right up front. Not leaving it till the end, but just to say it right up front in case I forget as we get there a little bit later. I don't script any of this, so I just want to make sure that I got that out there. So Psalm 19, 19, 20, and 21 they're all attributed to David, and he has some very interesting things to say. Now, Psalm 19 is actually one of my favorites, and it really does kind of, it has some parallel, I would say, to what we read in Psalm 8, and it really is David looking at the creation and his marveling at the actual creation itself, which all of us really should. It's a marvelous thing to behold what God has made. But in this one here, in particular, he goes even a little bit further into it, and it's actually one section of the same psalm, and he seems to change directions in after, I think it's at verse 7 is where it starts. But there is a relation between them, and we'll explain that. The rest of the other two that we'll do really kind of looks more towards the kings, and we get that it's pretty subtle, but there's a general audience sound to it, but it really does seem to focus more on the kings and those who would follow after him. So we'll pick that up as we get there, kind of explaining it a little bit. But for Psalm 19, again, just one of my personal favorites. I very much appreciate what I read here, and his recognition, I guess you could say, of the creative genius of God, and paying his, I guess what you would say, due respect and reverence that he has towards God when he considers the creation, and then really the way that God communicates with his creation. That's it also found in the Psalms, and or in this psalm rather, and it really alludes to the writings that were there in place, the giving of the law, and how man can be governed, if you will, by God, and that it's a wonderful thing. So all of that is presented for us here in the first one. So let's not put it off any longer. Let's look at Psalm 19, and let's have a word of prayer as we open. Father, we thank you so much for the privilege that it is to study your word and to have you instruct us by the work of the Holy Spirit. We give to you all thanks, and we would ask, Lord, that you would give us ears to hear, making application to the things that are here, because it really does speak so much about you and what we know of you, and especially in our times, as we know even better about you and how you would do the things that you would do, knowing what it looks like genuinely to have salvation. And as David alludes to those things, may we take what his words are and really expand them in our understanding. Would you do that for us and open our eyes of understanding and knowledge? And we give you thanks in Jesus' name. Okay, so Psalm 19, once again, is not intended to be in any way kind of a scientific view of the things. It's just what he recognizes by the observable world around him. It's the observation of things. And it really does create in him what you can see as kind of this worshipful way of recognizing the what would be the otherwise insignificance of man when he takes into consideration the creation of God and its vastness and the omnipotence and the power of God, and yet that he's so personally involved with his creation. It just is something that is a magnificent thing as David reckons it. It's amazing to him. So in Psalm 19, let's just read the first 6 verses because they all kind of go together. Verse 7 seems like a little bit of a change of direction, but there is a theme to this, which we'll point out when we get there. So in verse 1, it says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork." So I said I was going to read the whole thing. "Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard," or "their voice is not heard." That "where" is there for the flow. It's not actually in the original language. It says also, "Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them he has set a tabernacle for the sun, which is like a bridegroom coming out of his chamber and rejoicing as a strong man to run his race," or its race. "Its rising is from one end of heaven, and its circuit is to the other end, and there is nothing hidden from its heat." So there's a metaphor that he uses in this and the things at the end of it, but he's just talking about how the sun, the daytime, will be at the rising of the sun until it goes to the other end of its circuit and then it vanishes away. Now, he doesn't understand the cosmology of all of this. I mean, he's writing this 3,500 years ago. But remember what he says, "The heavens declare your glory." So this is more his looking at this and say that creation cries out that there is a creator. Now, that's not just his observation. That's what he actually tries to convey in the writing here. So when he says the heavens declare the glory of God, it's really kind of a way of saying that the very creation itself, it testifies, it cries out, and for the reason of recognizing that there is a creator behind everything that we see. Now, we as believers, as Christians, would absolutely say correct. And frankly, you find that Paul has very much this same kind of a way of looking at it in the first chapter of Romans, where he talks about that what may be known of God is seen in man themselves. And the language of this really kind of helps us understand in the next part of this, where it says, "Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge." This is in the way of saying that as time goes by, that very same creation just reveals more and more as time goes on. Now, we would understand that. The thought behind this, think about what we know of God's creation in the 21st century here, 2023, as opposed to what it was like for David in, like 1,000 years before Jesus. So we're talking about 3,000 years ago, roughly, that David writes this, just in round figures. So think about the stuff that we know of the creation itself. And that's because God, in a progressive kind of way, the more that time has gone by, the more that science has developed the ability to look into the structure of life and even at the molecular level, that kind of knowledge is passed on, and day by day it's revealed more. So that's what David's trying to get to, that day unto day it utters speech, or it proclaims to us the glory of God, right? The second part of that, and night unto night reveals knowledge. So that knowledge is added upon as time goes by. So the design of God, let's just say all the things that we know for sure, the tilt of the earth, the proximity to the sun, the gravity that is here, the atmosphere that's here, the liquid form of water, just example after example after example can be given to show that there's a deliberate intent behind the creation, because we don't find something like the earth anywhere that we've ever been able to observe. And if it wasn't exactly as it is, it could not sustain life. So once again, when we look at that, David couldn't have possibly understood, or even the actual human body itself and the complexity of the biology of the human body. He couldn't have possibly understood that, and how intricately designed it is, and how genius the engineering is, even though it's breaking apart at all times. And mainly that's because we're in a fallen creation. But the fact that life can sustain here on the earth is nothing short of miraculous, and it's a clear intent, it's a clear design. So again, verse 2 would tell us, as time goes by, we see the evidence of this more and more, and the heavens themselves, they declare that. So looking up into the sky, and the things seen by the Hubble telescope, and the other ones seen after that, and the vastness of the universe, or just the sky above you, the firmament. And so that just shows that creative genius of God. So then you fast forward that 1,000 years to the time of Jesus and just after, when Paul writes the book of Romans, and read what he has to say after verse 18 of chapter 1 through pretty much the end of the chapter. And you'll see there that man is without excuse as far as Paul is concerned, that the very existence of man should make a person, anyone who's looking at it, say, I can't explain this through any other means other than that there is a creator. And then it is incumbent upon man to learn who that creator is. And this is important for us as believers. And as we give testimony for what it is that we believe, we want to point people to a creator, but not just in the sense of saying there's one who created us as though we can't know him. We have to be able to explain him or speak of him in ways that we can make him known. It's just too important to leave to chance. We want to show them without really any question that there is a deliberate design behind the creation of mankind, and that it takes an intelligence to do the things that are done. We want to be conversant enough in that particular topic that we're able to show it to a person and then say, and that same person that I'm talking about is deeply personal with his creation. And it opens up the lines for us to be able to explain the gospel and to teach. So in verse 3 it says, now there is no speech nor language, their voice is not heard. And so there's not, it's not that it's confined to a language or speech. It's not that there is some kind of communication that goes. It's just a self-evident thing. That's what he's getting across. So as we look at the creation, it doesn't need to speak in the verbal sense. It speaks in just what it presents to us, that it leaves us with the only possible explanation is that there is a God who has created these things. The heavens declare his glory. They speak forth his glory, or about his glory. So it says, their line has gone out through all of the earth, and their words to the end of the world, that testimony. So the boundaries, the line is kind of the boundaries. And so wherever the creation can be seen by the human eye, no matter where the boundaries are as far as it goes, they continue to utter forth this speech, testify of his glory, his magnificence, his greatness, his omnipotence, all of those things. With that being said, I mean, just think about this. It's what we know. Let's compare ourselves to David's time. Not only do we have a better understanding of the intricacies of his creation, we have a better understanding scientifically and design-wise, and like I say, biology, all that kind of stuff. We have such a better grasp of it than David could have ever possibly had. And we also have another thing that is superior to David's, and it's just because of the time in which he lived. It's nothing about David. But think about what we know about the nature of God as we would speak of him. Because we know him as the one who saves, and not just that we can say, well, he's the God who saves. We know how he saves. We know through whom he saved and how it was done, because we have the person of Jesus Christ. So we know that whole part of the story as well. So when we read things like this, and where David says these things, it kind of makes it where I'd love to be able to say, David, if only you could see it through my eyes. Well, he doesn't have to. He has a better understanding of it than I do currently, because now he's in God's presence and it's known to him. But as I read his words from those 3,000 years back, I'm able to look at this and go, wow, what he knew at his time and what I know at my time gives perfect example of what we see in those verses 2, 3, and 4, where the heavens declaring the glory, his creation declaring who he is seen, and it progresses by the day as knowledge increases and as our understanding is more formed. we understand it even better than anybody who before us could have lived. We see it more so as time goes by. I will throw in this thing too. We also have another benefit where so much of what God said would be taking place, especially in our day and age, is happening right here and right now. Yeah, the physical universe itself, as he's created it, declares it. It shouts forth about who he is and his magnificence. But the fact that he will tell us about things before they take place does the same exact thing. It has that same reaction. Now, verse 5. This circuit, and as it goes out, it says, the second part of verse 4, I'm sorry. In them, that is in the boundaries, he has set a tabernacle for the sun. So think of the daytime sky from sunrise to sunset. That's what he's got in mind here. It's like a bridegroom coming forth out of the chamber, like at the beginning of the presentation, the rising of the sun, or another analogy that he gives. It is also, and it rejoices like a strong man ready to run a race, a person who is a champion, if you will, who's about ready to put on display his greatness and his ability. And so there's a rejoicing in that. There's an excitement that a person of that kind of ability is about to go put on display what they have as their greatness. So it says, its rising is from one end of the heaven and its circuit to the other end. So it's always going from beginning to end. So east to west, next day east to west. It's always on a circuit. And it says, and there is nothing that is hidden from its heat. So everything during the daylight, it's all illuminated. And that's, there's no place that gets away from that. You have to have something artificial to cover yourself from the sun, but it cannot be avoided. Even whatever you might have as a covering is going to be affected by its heat. So he then goes on to what seemingly is an unrelated topic. And you can see it because he starts to say the law of the Lord. And he would say, what does the law of the Lord have to do with the physical creation? And think about this. It's because of how he says that the heavens declare his glory. It's a way of God saying he communicates truth to us, even in the creation, just the observable world around us. It tells us, it testifies that there is a creator. Now, that same creator has not just left it to the creation that cannot speak, he's also added to it his word, which does speak directly and in detail. And it's interesting because he gives a series of these, this is this, and it has this result. So if you look at the first part of this, the law of the Lord is perfect. The law of the Lord, it is perfect, and it converts the soul. So there is those three elements. There is this part, and it is this as a descriptive part of it. So there is the noun, if you will. There is this thing, and here is its characteristics, its adjective, and here is the end result of it. And he has a series of those where he mentions the law, the testimonies, the statutes, the commandments, the fear, and the judgments. So we'll look a little bit at what those words have to say, and then the application to us. Once again, this comes down to the written word and how God has communicated things to us. Now, as David writes these things, remember, so much of the Bible was yet to be written. So much of it. So all of the prophets, major and minor, were still to be written. All of the things that Solomon would write and those kinds of things, those were still yet future. Ezra, Nehemiah, Ruth, Esther, all of that stuff, it's still down the road. So all of that's got to be there, plus, needless to say, every bit of the New Testament. So when David writes about what he does, he's thinking of what is present at his time, the Torah, basically, the writings of the law. And those things are given for the sake of instruction. How much more so ours, because we have everything that David had, and then so much that has been additional. And it's God communicating to us. So there's the physical universe that tells us of him. And then there is also the writings that he tells us of himself in his writings. He reveals himself through the authors that he has inspired to write the things that he did. And one other piece to add to that, then we have the historical personages and what they were all about, all the way up to the person of Jesus and what he accomplished. We have his words. Though his ministry was 3+ years, what we have is just a very, very small sampling of that, and it changed the history of the world. So pretty cool. So what David has in front of him is once again only magnified and vastly expanded in our time. Think of everything that's been added since the time David wrote this. And it's most of the Bible as we know it is after this time. So the previous books cover a lot of time, no question about it, because from Abraham to David's time is 1,000 years. And before that is a couple thousand years from the creation to the time that Abraham was called out of Ur. So pretty interesting stuff when you really stop to think about it. And it's why it's always good for us to understand the history of what we're reading, and then to make the observations that we do of saying, well, what's David's world compared to ours? What do we know that might be even greater than what he could have known? And when you start asking those kinds of questions, you just begin to understand, boy, it's a vast, vast difference. So we read in verse 7, it says, now the law of the Lord, and the law is simply looking at what was given through Moses. It's the instructions that God gives. So it has statutes, it has commands, it has judgments, it has all of those things. Those are dealt with as well as individual components, if you will. But when he mentions the law, it's just the instruction of God. When he gives us information, in this case, the law that came through Moses of you must do this, you must not do that. If you're a child of God and a child of if you're the children of Israel, this is how you will be governed, and this is the law, and it's given by God, and this is your conduct. So this is the instruction. It says that the law of the Lord, it is perfect, means that it's unblemished, having the resulting effect of the converting of the soul. And converting of a soul means the soul itself is by definition separate from God and alienated. And yet the law, if it's understood, because it is perfect and unblemished, if it's accepted, as David would see it, the resulting effect is that it would convert the soul from a place of being distant from God and rejected to a place of acceptance. And that's how it was as far as the law was concerned. So we would have our New Testament version of this. We would be able to say the entirety of the Scripture is still every bit as pure, but it's really the message that it conveys that really does the work of the converting of the soul as we understand it. Appropriating what we see in Scripture changes who we are at a fundamental level. So we're no longer who we were before we were saved. The reading of God's Word and applying it and being obedient to it has the effect, the resulting effect is the conversion of the soul. We've gone from death into life because we've become obedient to what the Word has to say. So he moves to the second of these things. Says, now the testimony of the Lord is sure. The testimony is just the things that it admonishes you to do. And the idea of it being sure, it means that it's right. It means that it's to say that sure, it's something that it is to be believed. So for us, when we read the Scriptures, we say, is it something that we can put our trust and our faith in? Absolutely, because it's sure. Okay, it's trustworthy, or it's worthy of our trust. So again, these testimonies, these admonitions, the things that it encourages us or admonishes us to do, because God says, this is what I expect. There's also the admonition of saying, and to walk rightly before him is to do those things, otherwise there's consequence. So then it says, it's sure and it makes wise the simple. So even the simple person, by applying the things that God has said, would be wise among their peers by comparison. So this is one of those things I also find wonderful. Whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, this is just so encouraging to me that you don't have to be a genius to understand the Scriptures. And so it was written to the every man and every woman, of course. So it doesn't take some kind of a college degree to understand. It doesn't take some kind of towering intellect to grasp. It is written so that everyone can come to an understanding of it, which is what God would want because he loves his creation equally. No matter how brilliant a person may be or just how basic and simple a person may be, any of them can come to an understanding, and it is able to take even the most simple and make them wise because of how they've applied what they see. Again, take the simple person that's come to an understanding of the gospel and compare that to the most brilliant mind that the world can produce that doesn't know him, and I'll show you the person who has wisdom. It's not the person with the brilliance and the high IQ. It's really the person who says, God's made a promise. I believe that he can do what he says. I put my trust and my faith in him, and God would say, wise decision. So, when it comes to the testimony, those things that are to be believed, they will make the wise simple. Now, the statutes, it says, of the Lord, they are right, rejoicing the heart. So the statutes are the precepts, the things that the Bible charges us to do. Gives us this, here's what we expect. Paul says it to Timothy. Timothy, I charge you. I'm giving you this. Be ready in season and out of season. That idea of a person from a place of authority saying to the next person, this is what is an expectation. I charge you, this is what you are supposed to do. So the statutes or the charges, the precepts, they are right, they're appropriate, they fit, they're acceptable. So it says the statutes of the Lord, they are right, and they rejoice the heart, or rejoicing the heart. It's not just that it happened once, but it continues to. So it makes the heart glad. I would just ask any of you who are hearing what I'm saying in this, ask yourself, is that really what the scriptures do for you? The scriptures are never intended to put us in a place that when we read them, it makes us hang our heads and we feel despondent and broken. Now, if you do, it's really because God is saying, I'm only bringing these things to your attention so that you can get these things right before me. And that's a good thing. It's best to have that kind of instruction, because once you get that behind you, settle it between you and the Lord, you can move on from that time of feeling broken and as though you've really done some kind of harm. So when we read that idea that the statutes, they're right, they're fitting, and they cause the heart to rejoice, it says, now the commandments of the Lord, or the commandment, singular, the commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. Now the commandment is just, if it's a single, it's a code of law, something that God has put in place and says, this is what I expect. It's enumerated, it's written out, and it is to be followed, it's to be understood. So the commandment or the code of law, it is pure, it's clean, and it's unspotted. It has no blemish in it. So with that, the commandment of the Lord, it is pure, and it opens the eyes, it enlightens, it gives illumination to the eyes. So we all know what this is like. You can go into a dark room and close the door behind you, and there's nothing that's going on. You can't see anything. If it's at night and there's no other illumination anywhere else, you can't see anything. Hand in front of your face, you'd never see it. Flip on the light switch, now everything can be seen because light has been brought into a dark place and everything is illuminated and it's able to be seen by the eye. So again, this is the commandment. The commandments will do this. They will, when God gives direction of law, it opens our eyes to these truths because those things are pure, they're clean, they're unspotted. Now it says, the fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. So that fear is the awe, it's the respect, it's the reverence that we have for God. It's not the cowering in the corner because we're afraid of God. It's rather there is a recognition of who he is in his vastness, his greatness, his power, his authority, his majesty, all of those things. They're not to put us in a place of trembling and fear, but rather of a matter of awe and reverence and respect for who he is. And again, that same thing that we recognize his greatness, at the same time he has called us to his side and he loves us and has given us a means of salvation. So that's why we can fear him but not be in fear of him. Okay? So it talks about the fear of the Lord, which is that awe and that respect, that reverence. The fear of the Lord, it is clean. Once again, it's pure, it's unspotted, it's undefiled, and it endures forever. It has the effect on the person's life that has a benefit in the eternal sense. So again, it's that thing that brought us to him. It's that recognizing who he is and who we are in him that brings on that, who am I that you would pay such attention or any kind of attention to me, that really draws a person into that place of just saying, as an enduring way, that recognition of God and paying him his due honor. It's all part of being saved and recognizing what we've been saved from. That leads to eternal benefit. Now it says also, closing out this section, the judgments of the Lord, they are true, And so the judgments, that having been tried, when God is making a judgment, it's that I've taken all of the appropriate information, I've judged it, it's been adjudicated, and here is my judgment on the matter. It's meant as a very much a judicial kind of thing. As we see judges here, they will look at all of the evidence, they will put it on trial, if you will, and then they will make a judgment. So all throughout, especially when you look at the times where the children of Israel, or under the times of the kings, that something would happen and God would have to send a prophet, or whether he was speaking through Moses, it's because something had taken place and God is saying, here's what I'm going to do because I've examined the situation and I've adjudicated it. Here is what needs to take place from that point on. So the judgments of the Lord, they are true and righteous. Wonderful. So no one, as God would say, this is what I'm going to do, would be able to say, well, you made your decision based on bad information. That's impossible. Righteous means that they're acceptable and that there is no putting the thumb on the scale, because he does everything in a way where he's not looking to change the outcome. He's just being honest with all of the details that are given. The judgments of the Lord, they are true and righteous altogether, completely, with no equivocation. There's nothing in what God says. So let's just put it this way. From David's time, David doesn't understand, he couldn't understand the thoroughness, I guess you could say, of what really is taking place for the end of times. And here, ultimately, when man has to stand before God, no one will be able to stand before him and say, if only you had told us, and try to use that as some kind of an excuse that, God was not faithful enough to communicate to us, and so now we're being held accountable for something that we wouldn't have done otherwise. No, it's right altogether. There's everything that God will ever do, because he's told you in advance of his plans. If a person will ignore those things, they're going to have to deal with the consequences of that themselves. So everything that he does is just, it's correct, it is righteous in its entirety, altogether, to the fullest extent. And so we go back to those things about these, if it's the law, the testimonies, the statutes, the commandments, the judgments, or the fear, more are they to be desired than gold, yes, than much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. So seeking after those things. Let's make a modern application to it again. As we look at the whole of the scripture, the 66 books that we have of the Old and New Testament, to look at them, they are to be pursued after, like David talks about. Mainly, he's only able to look at the writings of Moses as far as this is concerned for instruction. So he can look back at the history, which is really kind of covered in Genesis, and the beginning of Exodus, of how God was bringing the children of Israel back into the land. But it was through Moses that God begins to put things in writing. He writes those things out and gives them a written law, a code. And so David would say that code that God has given, as he's communicated to us, not only through his creation, but through the actual words that he would speak through Moses and writing them down. As far as the law is concerned, all of those things are to be sought after. And they are to be considered as something that is precious and that you would really go after to try to obtain. So he ends up saying in verse 11, moreover, here's the resulting effect. And so when you see moreover, just think therefore or furthermore is kind of what he is saying here. It says, furthermore, by them, those things that we've seen, the judgments, the statutes, all those things, by those things your servant then is warned. And the warn is meaning you're instructed by those things. The warning is there's instruction that God gives, and then there's consequence for the ignorance of his instruction. So he says, moreover, they are through them your servant is warned, and in keeping there is great reward. Okay, obedience to the scriptures and obedience to what it says has a great reward. That's pretty obvious. So it says, who can understand his errors and then cleanse me from my secret faults? So the idea that God is so holy and pure that David would say, even with the instruction, I can't even tell when I might violate in some of the smallest ways. And so he says, clear me of my guilt of those things that I might do in my innocence, not even realizing them. It's not that you're innocent in it, but your ignorance of those is probably a better word than innocence. But those secret things that he doesn't really, that are really not of his attention, because he contrasts those with the others, where he says, who can understand his errors? Cleanse me from my faults. And then verse 13, keep back your servant also from presumptuous sins. And presumptuous is just the pride and the arrogance. I know that these things are things that God would not have me to do, but I'm going to do them anyway because they are satisfying to me. So he says, let them not have rule or dominion over me, and then I shall be blameless and I shall be innocent of great transgressions. So David would never say he's sinless, but as far as God communicating to him, and if he is free of those things, God, keep me free of those things that I can't see. Help me to understand the things, and help me to not fall into the pride and arrogance of the things that I can see. And if I can do that, then I'm going to be right before you, which is ultimately what he wants to be. He will be then blameless and innocent of great transgression. So he says, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart, the things that I say, the meditation of my heart, as I consider you, those things of the inner person, may they be acceptable in your sight, my Lord, my strength, and my Redeemer. What a wonderful verse. So Psalm 19, just one of my absolute favorites because of those really, actually any of those pieces, the three parts of it that we see, the verses 1 to 6, are so cool because it's God declares things through his creation. And then what we get up through verse 7 through 10, is God communicates through his word. So you have the observable universe, the written word that is left for us, communicating to us, and then the resulting effect. And the fact that we can call upon God to open our eyes to these things, making it possible that the things that David asks for could actually become realized and actually take place. Psalm 20. David, you'll see that there's a word in here where he speaks about your anointed. And so he's referring to the king. And so this would be down the line to the kings. Now remember, as David writes this, David knows, as only the second king that Israel ever had, he has Saul, and he has only his life, Saul's life and his life to compare these things to. As I read these things, I just think it's better that David didn't know how things were going to go from the kings down the line. And so you get a kind of an impression in this that, well, since this is what God is doing in me, and this is what the kings of Israel are supposed to do, you would think that the kings who would follow him would be the same way. And in turn, we find out that it's not the same in any conceivable way. For the early part of Solomon's life, it was. He was a very good, I wouldn't say replacement, but for lack of a better term, let's call him that. As David has gone on to his reward with the Lord, then Solomon takes his place, and his early years were good. Latter years, not so much. So much that there was turmoil in the kingdom, and after his death, his son didn't know how to rule anywhere near what he should. And there was a rebellion, and the nation split and became Judah and Israel as we know them, and that was because of Rehoboam, Solomon's son. So Judah had a few good kings, probably more, well, I would say more bad than good, and the north never had a good king in its entire existence. And it was kind of put out more than 100 years before Judah actually had its judgment. So David says all of these things, and you can sense there's a real hopefulness in him. And that's why he says, may it be this way, may it be like that, may it be, and these are just kind of almost benediction kind of things. May it be like this towards God's anointed, not even thinking that there could be a time when the nation would split into two parts because of a division, because of bad leadership. So let's just take it at face value. As David would be saying this, what seems to be to the kings who would follow after him, this is his hopefulness for them, his wish. May it be so. So, may the Lord answer you in the day of trouble, and may the name of the God of Jacob defend you. Let God, who is the God of Jacob, David's way of saying the one who's been with us from the beginning, may he be your defense. But he starts off by saying, may the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. So that means it implies two things. There are times when the king will be troubled by circumstances, and it also implies that he will cry out, the king will at that time, and he will be heard. And then at that point, once you've been heard and God is working in these things, let him be the one who is your defense. Let him be the one who comes to your aid or to your defense. May he send you help from the sanctuary and strengthen you out of Zion, the place of his dwelling. Because that was God who said, Jerusalem is the place, and this mountain here in Jerusalem, this is my dwelling place. This is where I will be. This is my habitation. So if help is going to come from somewhere, let it be from there, because that's where God is. So he says, may God remember all of your offerings and accept your burnt sacrifice. So once again, David, when he would offer things, never did it because he was going through the motions. And may it be the same for everyone who follows after him. May there be a sincerity in your offerings that God, when he sees them, would recall those things and see that it is a matter of sincerity, and may it go accordingly, right? So when God would accept those things, that means that the offering was acceptable to him, and mainly that's because the heart was acceptable to him as well. Because there were times when they would do the offerings like they were supposed to by rote, but God would say, yeah, they do the offerings, but their heart's in the totally wrong place. So their offerings, though they might be textbook perfect, are not even acceptable to me because the heart's the issue. So he says in verse 4, may he grant you according to your heart's desire and fulfill all of your purpose or your plans. Now, there is an implication to this. And it's something that we ought to remember as well, because we see that also, that talk about that God will give you the desires of your heart, right? We know that this is something that has to have some things assumed, because we can put this to the test and it doesn't take a whole lot to see. Does that mean that God will give me whatever I want, the desires of my heart, and make good on my plans? Well, what if those things are evil? Is God going to back your play because you've read something like this and think, okay, I'm in control of everything, and so he said he's going to do this? Or it's really not God saying this at this point, it's David saying this. But David's able to look at this kind of from his perspective to the point where it really is evident to people around him. Think about it when he had said to Nathan, I want to build God a house. And this is, Solomon's alive, but he doesn't think for a moment it's going to be Solomon who's going to build the temple. He thinks it's him. And so he says that to Nathan, and Nathan says, basically, my paraphrase, everything you touch turns to gold. You ought to just go ahead and go for it. God's with you in all these things. And God had to tell him, no, I didn't tell you to say that to him. So you're going to have to go back to tell him that I'm not going to have him do that, but it'll be his son. And there's a forever promise in that. So this idea that you can just presumptuously think that whatever I ask, that God would just give me whatever I want, and whatever my plans are, that he would make them come to fruit. Well, that assumes that what you're wanting is what he would want as well. So it means a few different things. You have to know God's heart in these matters, and you don't act presumptuously. You would ask him before you would act. That's all just, it has to be assumed in this. So whenever we see those passages about ask of me whatever you want and the Father will give it to you, or passages like this, that he would give you the desires of your heart and that he would make good on your plans, make sure that you're not asking for something that he wouldn't already be on board with. Because frankly, if you ask for something that you know is just really evil or wrong or completely outside of his will, don't expect him to do something just because you cooked it up in your head. So he says, now we will rejoice in your salvation, and in the name of our God we will set up our banners. May the Lord fulfill all of your petitions. And that's so David's still speaking to the kings and the people after him. He's certainly not saying this in the way like he's addressing it to the Lord. You can tell that by the way that the language is. And in the name of our God, we will set up our banners. That's our flag. That's making our standard. We'll let everyone know who and what we are and what we believe. May the Lord fulfill all of your petitions. So speaking those things that you would say to God, but assuming that they're in line with what he would do anyway, he's not going to deny his, who he is by his nature. So it says, now I know that the Lord saves his anointed. That's how we know that it's kings. At least David speaking. He's not speaking about himself in the third person here. That's why it's pretty much assumed that he's speaking to the kings who would come after him. All of what we've read so far makes perfect sense that would be his audience. And yeah, does it have application to the here and now and I should say of his time to the people who were there? Yeah, there's no reason to think that that's not the case. But he's talking about to people who are in this place of authority, kings, the anointed. That's why it seems to be a much more select group that he's writing to. So I know that the Lord saves his anointed. And that's not just speaking in the eternal sense. David can speak from experience and said, before I was ever selected, he saved me from the mouth of lions. He saved me from Saul. Now he's saved him from all of the enemies who have looked to destroy him, even in his own family. So David would be able to say, yeah, God saves his anointed. He preserves him through these types of things until he no longer does. Because obviously David's not alive today, not here physically on earth, so he had an end at some point. His point is that while God is doing these works in your life, then he's going to complete them. He will sustain the anointed. So it says, he will answer from his holy heaven, and with the saving strength of his right hand. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we, by contrast, we the kings, the people who are governed by God and the leaders of the people, the kings, we will remember the name of the Lord our God. They have bowed down and they have fallen, but we have risen and we stand upright. Now, again, you'd like to say, if you were reading this, boy, David, your heart would be broken if you were able to see what comes down the road. But this is the ideal. This is the hopefulness. This is his desire. And imagine being a king after David, whether in the north or the south, reading this and just, you're either going to be completely numb to it or don't even pay attention to it. Or maybe somebody who should know better, who's, has that repentant heart, is what it would have hopefully done for somebody who had gone astray. But we can look through the history of the kings of Israel and Judah and realize these guys did not heed this counsel. So it says, save, Lord, may the king answer us when we call. Now that goes from the temporary kings, that when we, the kings of the earth, cry out to you, the King of heaven, will you hear us when we call? What a wonderful closing to that. Now, in verse 20 or chapter 21 or Psalm 21, we read this: the king shall have joy in your strength, O Lord. And this is, once again, David, as he says this, there is this idea of strength that's mentioned here, and it's we might just think of physical strength, and yet this is something that's different. This is the word that we get for rock, like when we think at Mount Horeb, and the rock that was struck by Moses, and water came out. And it's not just a stone, it's not just a rock. A strength is like really something that is much larger foundationally, where we also get cliff, or this collection of this foundational stone. So that's what's being referred to here. So from your strength is that your place or your position of authority and greatness and grandeur. It's not just little rocks here and there. It's not just some minor strength. It is something foundationally sure and cannot be moved. So the king will have joy in your strength, O Lord, and in your salvation how greatly shall he rejoice. So continuing on with that line of the kings, that salvation, not only here and now, but the promise of the eternal as well. But that would be such a guiding thing to them. So in verse 2 it says, you have given him his heart's desires. Now notice that's an interesting thing in addition to what we had already read. You have placed in him what is your heart's desires. It's not what he can come up with. But because if the king is paying attention to the Lord, then God, your priorities have become his priorities. And if that's our understanding of giving the desires and everything else, then that makes perfect sense. A king, if he's walking rightly before God, is going to have the things that he desires and plans are already in keeping with what God would have, so God will make good on those things because they're in line with his will and not the will of just what anybody can ever hope to get. Really, really important that we understand that distinction. In verse 2, you have given him his heart's desire, and you have not withheld the request of his lips. For you meet him with blessing and with goodness. So when he comes to you, you come to him as well. You meet him there, and it's with these blessings of good things. And so again, it's that promise. And it's what God said he would do with David. Even when Solomon was asked, what would you have me give to you? And Solomon just said, I don't know how to lead the people. I'm not my father, my paraphrase. And but he says, I just may I have understanding and give me wisdom on how it is that I can lead your people, because I don't know how to do this. And God says, well, I'll give you exactly what you need in order to do that, and I'm going to give you all the stuff you didn't ask for. And so riches, and for your enemies to be subdued, and all those things. And with all of that, still he rebelled. Amazing. So it says in verse 3, for you meet him with blessings of goodness, and you set a crown of pure gold upon his head. Once again, you are the one who has placed the king in his position. Now that's always, unfortunately, from this point on, it's not always reciprocal. More times than not, when you compare the kings after David, whether in the north or the south, the crown may have been on his head, but it wasn't placed there by God in the way of approval. And so it says, verse 4, he asked life from you, and you gave it to him. And so David is speaking more of himself. And so, yeah, I've asked for that length of life, and it's been given to me. Length of days forever and ever. Interesting that it's David obviously didn't live forever and ever on this earth, but his heritage really moved on. And actually, he was promised that at the time I mentioned earlier, when he wanted to build the temple, and God said, I'm not going to have him build the temple, Nathan. You got to go back there and tell him no, but let him know this. I'm going to build him an enduring house, and there will be a king that will sit on that throne forever in the eternal sense. So we have that already understood. Now it says in verse 5, speaking of the king, his glory is great in your salvation, and that glorying is the way of proclaiming, the glorying. It's kind of the honoring, the glorying, or the speaking forth of these things. The glory is great, his glory is great, rather, in your salvation, that being the king. Honor and majesty you have placed upon him. And so he'll recognize who he is in you, and he'll give the due honor and respect to that position. So it says, for you have made him most blessed forever. And the most blessed, does that mean above everyone else, or most blessed in just way of saying the blessing is just above and beyond what anybody could expect? And that's really what he's getting at here. You have made him exceedingly glad with your presence, for the king trusts in the Lord, and through the mercy of the Most High he shall not be moved. What a great confidence that is. Now, if we make a New Testament kind of an application to this, which we should do as we go along the way here, and realize his world is a lot different than ours. As we read this, we're not the kings. And yet, can we look through things like this, that has God made us exceedingly glad with his presence? The fact that he is with us. Actually, we have an understanding of the presence of God that he could have only imagined. And that is the indwelling Holy Spirit who lives within us and gives us direction and guides us. So David couldn't have possibly understood that yet. He obviously understands it now, but the believer, it's easy for us to take for granted that we have benefit that David could have never even imagined. The idea of the resident Holy Spirit in the life of us. For the king trusts in the Lord, and that should be to all people. The king does, and so should the rest of us. And through the mercy of the Most High, he shall not be moved. So if God is merciful, then nothing will be able to move him. Now, that is it has a twofold way with him. He can't be moved spiritually, and as with David, he cannot be taken from his throne by the devisings of man. Can't be. So there were times when he may have thought that wasn't possible, but just again, the idea that if God has something that he has promised to do in us, there is nothing that can change that. It's God who's made the promise, so it's God who's going to make good on that promise. And so when people kind of really struggle with their lives and think, I don't measure up, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do, and there's all the doubt and everything else, look, it's not up to you to maintain those things. It's for God to do. So it says in verse 8, your hand will find all of your enemies. This is David speaking about the Lord, because your hand will find your enemies. These are the enemies that God has. It's not the king that's being spoken of anymore. Your right hand will find those who hate you. So it's not the power and the authority of the king. It's rather the power and the authority of God. And we get that here because he starts to talk about the way of judgment. So he says, in verse 9, you shall make them as a fiery oven in the time of your anger. the Lord shall swallow them up in his wrath, and the fire shall devour them. Now, David is saying these things just in his understanding of how things are. And yeah, he's seen this take place in his life, the enemies that would come against him and how God would deal with them. But boy, he has some really interesting things to say here that for us who understand what is future to this world, because we've seen it in a lot of detail, David has, I guess you could say, a precursor kind of an understanding of what it will be like. We're able to look at it and say, gosh, with all the additional information that we've been given, David saw it in big picture. We see it with specifics. So it says, you shall make them as a fiery oven in the time of your anger. The Lord will swallow them up in his wrath, and the fire shall devour them. Now, as you read that, you think, well, that just makes, well, actually, here's what we hear sometimes from people. We hear, well, look at that. That's just that gloom and doom that God's going to, destroy everybody, and that, he's such a bloody, angry God. Well, look at what he says here. This is very, very interesting. It says, their offspring you shall destroy from the earth, and their descendants from among the sons of men. Why? For they intended evil against you. They devised a plot which they are not able to perform. There is the issue. Does God just unilaterally, with no provocation, just wipe people out? That's the impression that many people have. It's completely inaccurate. Because we know from a number of places, Old and New Testament, where God says that he has no desire for that, but he's not going to make somebody accept his terms. People are going to have to make their own decisions, but if their decision is rejection of him, they do that at their own peril, and they're the ones who devise these evil things. Now, as I look at the world around us, especially, gosh, it seems like it's just picking up speed every day. But the world is in a place of rebellion against him openly in our own country like I've never seen it before. And of course, will there be a time when God judges that? Obviously. How can he not? Because he has said, these are the things that are acceptable to me. And man, in his arrogance and ignorance, will absolutely reject everything that he has to say, and they will defiantly reject any kind of governance from him. So what are they supposed to do? What we see on display in our country with the culture is not just saying that it's not just that we don't agree with him. It's not just that we disagree with him. We are going to openly flaunt our disagreement, and we will challenge anybody to say anything about it. So it's really interesting that the Christian is becoming much more marginalized than we've ever been before. And yet, at the same time, we just recognize these people have their hostility and their anger towards God, who says, these are the things that are acceptable, these are the things that are unacceptable. Man hates that kind of governance over his life, and he'll rebel. The believer is kind of different from that, because at that point we just realize, I know what I'd like to do, but I also know that it's not what God accepts, and it's ultimately, these are on his terms. So he's right and he's just in doing these things because they really fired the first shot, if you will. God doesn't wipe them out just because he enjoys doing that. It's that they have rejected him and devised evil against him, and against his people at the same time. So it says they devised a plot that they cannot, and that they are not able to perform or bring to fruit. They can't make it happen. Therefore, you will make them turn their back. You will make ready your arrows and your string toward their faces. So then he says this: be exalted, be lifted up, be brought high above. Be exalted, O Lord, in your own strength. That you be exalted by the things that you do. People will be able to recognize that you've done these things. So be exalted, O Lord, in your own strength. We will sing and praise your name. As you do those things, we will sit back and watch them, and we will sing and we will praise. So really interesting few of the Psalms. The next two that we have are really, really very, very important. One, because you hear it a lot of times at funerals. The Lord is my shepherd, the 23rd Psalm. The 22nd Psalm is as prophetic as really any Old Testament books or chapters or verses that you'll find anywhere in the scriptures when it comes to messianic things. And so what you find in here, the details given in this particular chapter about the crucifixion and what happened to Jesus at his death. My goodness, the detail that is given to us in here and how it played out in real time. We'll look at the parallels back and forth in the New Testament versus the Old, but there are two chapters that are just known for their accuracy with what actually took place. So Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53 are the two chapters that are so unbelievably accurate as to what happened in Jesus's trial, in his being put to death, and in the reason why it was done. So we'll leave that for next week. We pick up that at our next study, chapter 22, and we'll probably get through chapter 22 and 23. We might only have time for 22. We'll just have to see how it works. But we'll pick it up there next week. And so if you have any questions about any of what I've shared this week, or anything in the previous weeks that it comes to mind and you have a question about, contact us through the ministry's website and the contact us page, which is the email, and we'd love to hear from you. But we'll pick up at chapter 22 or Psalm 22 next week.